All right, today's lesson is on ecosystems, and we're starting with a quick look at our pond ecosystem that we set up yesterday. Everybody has their pictures here, and then you can take notes in your notebook too as we talk about ecosystems. This will be on our quiz in a couple weeks. We're not having a quiz this week on Friday. So here's our pond ecosystem. We just talked a little bit about types of living things we might see in our pond. And we're going to come back to this, similarities and differences in our pond and the real pond. We had that yesterday. So let's take a quick look at this. So here are a few notes and definitions for us. Now, what is an ecosystem? We've talked about this a couple times, but we haven't actually written it down. So who can tell me what is the definition of an ecosystem or examples of ecosystem? Who wants to help me with that? Yes. Excellent. A place where certain living and non-living things are. That's exactly true. And so, and oftentimes we forget about the second part of this, but an ecosystem is, let me try to write that so you can actually read it. A group of living things and their non-living surroundings. And we include the non-living surroundings because, as we talked about the other day, non-living surroundings include things like the water, the air, the energy from the sun, the rocks, the dirt, all of those things. You couldn't have an ecosystem. The living things couldn't live if they didn't have the non-living surroundings. Is our little pond in a cup an ecosystem? Is it? It is. It's a small ecosystem that's representing the big pond. Is it going to be different? Yes, we talked about differences. And over time, could our little pond ecosystem live indefinitely? What do you think? Is it going to die off over time? Probably. Some of the microscopic stuff could probably live nearly indefinitely, especially if we keep adding water to it. But as we've talked about, the bigger things, the fish, if you had bigger fish or bugs, they probably can't live there indefinitely. The plants will die off because it doesn't get enough sunlight. But it is an ecosystem that we can observe in our classroom. And so then scientifically, of course, we have to have big, crazy science words for the living parts and the non-living parts of an ecosystem. So biotic, bio means life, like biology. So the biotic parts, or the textbook, when we get to the textbook calls them biotic factors. But the biotic parts of the ecosystem are the living parts. Right? So that's pretty easy. It's the bugs, the algae, the bacteria, fish, frogs, plants, living parts of ecosystem. And so then abiotic, when you put a in front of a word, that prefix means without. The abiotic parts are, or abiotic factors, are the non-living parts of the ecosystem. So pretty easy. We've been talking about it already for several days. It's just a matter of putting some scientific words that you'll see in the textbook and that you'll hear from time to time. So not too tough. So take a quick minute, and for the pond ecosystem, either our pond in a cup or the big pond, and why don't you list some biotic elements and some abiotic elements or factors, or the textbook uses a couple different words for that. All right, so let's take a minute and list those things. Okay, now we can list a couple of the biotic and abiotic factors in the pond ecosystem. Not too tough here. Let's take a look at this. And this could be either a big pond or our pond. So I'll just pop around and call on some people. What are some of the biotic or abiotic factors? Okay. Plants. And what else? Insects. Yes. Bacteria. And again, these are going to end up being too small for us to see even with a microscope, but bacteria are very important. Yes. Absolutely. So in a bigger pond, aquatic reptiles or amphibians. Yes. Birds. See, and this is one of those big ways that the big pond is going to be different. We're going to have things like birds and bigger reptiles, turtles, and they're going to come and go, right? They're not going to spend their whole time living in the water. They go away and come back. They're still part of this ecosystem, but they move in and out. And with our little classroom pond, obviously that piece is not going to be possible. What else? Fish? Yes. And again, unfortunately, our little pond's not seeing that. How about some abiotic factors? What do we have for abiotic factors? Yes. Water, very important. All life depends on water. We forget about it sometimes. Yes. Rocks. And let's see. Yes. Dirt. How about dead trees? Yes, and this is, I was talking with one of my classes. So we're going to have things like dead trees, rotting logs, dead living things that are decomposing. These are absolutely part of the ecosystem. And I've talked to a couple different science people, and we're not, there's some disagreement on whether you'd call that biotic. It's obviously not alive, but it used to be alive. What about a leaf that fell off a tree? It's not rotting and dead yet, but it's no longer alive and growing and changing. So I don't care if you could put these in biotic or abiotic, but yeah, absolutely, these are an important part of the ecosystem. And as they die and decompose, the bacteria break them down and return the other nutrients to the ecosystem. All right, a couple more things and then we'll move on. Yes. Air. Oh, yes, very important. Air. And that, of course, includes oxygen, carbon dioxide. What else? Sunlight. Yes, we need to have sunlight or energy coming into the ecosystem. Okay. I think that's a pretty good list. It's not everything, but oh, how about our classroom ponds? What other abiotic thing that's a little bit, well, totally not out in the wild is kind of part of our ecosystem? Yes. Yeah. So ours, we have that little plastic cup, and it provides a boundary which is very different than the boundary of a real pond, right? It's cup shaped. It's kind of, it has steep walls. A real pond is going to, be more shallow on the edges and have things growing and all that. This is a very sudden boundary. So that's kind of part of the ecosystem. It's definitely a boundary, and it's definitely makes it very different. Okay, so let's scoot ahead here. You see here, though, that so many of the things are the same. We can still learn about ecosystems with our little pond ecosystem. Okay, so we're going to jump into the textbook in a few minutes, but I bet that you can figure out a few of these things before you look it up in the textbook. What needs are met by an organism's environment? So, right, you can't catch a bug and just keep it in a Tupperware, right? It has to be in its natural environment. What needs are met by an organism's environment? Quick guess on that? Yes. Sure. Needs to find water in its environment. What else? Yes. Shelter. One more biggie. Yes. Food. We also have kind of a science name for a place where an animal finds food, water, and shelter. What were you going to say? Yeah. I guess we're going to need, uh, yeah, air, oxygen, carbon dioxide. The place where the living thing finds food, water, and shelter is called habitat. And you might think, well, we already said ecosystem. Why do we need to say habitat? Well, in a pond ecosystem, are there more than one? Is there more than one habitat? Sure. What are some of the habitats within a pond ecosystem? What's one? Okay, good. Excellent. We were talking about that. If you have plants, there's going to be a lot of living things that live up in the plants. That's one little habitat that's going to keep them alive. And so then if the plants die, the little things that live in those plants might also die. What's another one? Rotting logs, right? Decaying things. We were talking about that. The bacteria and other decomposers, their habitat is breaking down those dead things. What else? Where are the fish living in the pond? In the water. Are they competing directly with the birds? Not really. The birds are kind of flying in and out of the habitat, in and out of the pond ecosystem. So there's different habitats, and each organism or each type of organism has its own little habitat where it lives. And that's why the pond ecosystem can support so many different kinds of life. Our little pond in a cup provides some of those habitats, but obviously not all of them. Okay, so I'm gonna let you look at the textbook for a few minutes and put some plants in your cup. And I think that is our main thing for today. The other thing we're gonna look at, characteristics of living things. And the other thing we get to talking about in this section, when we talk about ecosystems, how many people back in elementary school talked about food chains and food webs? Yeah? So food chain, food web. We'll talk about food webs. How's a food web different than a food chain? How is a web different than a chain? Yes. Yes. Yep. So food chain is very simple, right? Here's a plant and it gets eaten by a grasshopper, which gets eaten by a bird, which gets eaten by a coyote. It's very one way, right? But in real life, and we'll have better picture and notes on this later, but in real life, you have a plant, and that might be eaten by a grasshopper or a deer. See, that's a deer. You can tell because he has antlers. And the deer might be eaten by a coyote, and the grasshopper might be eaten by a bird. So it's much more complicated, a food web versus a food chain. And don't worry about that. We'll come back to that. But we will look at that as we're looking at ecosystems as well. All right. That is, I think, where we shall leave it today. I'm going to give you a chance to take a look at the textbook for these questions and put some plants in your ecosystem.